In the chill of dawn, Corporal James Dunn felt the ground rumble beneath his feet as he trudged across the desert. Dust storms had caked the landscape in a dull orange, smothering any sign of life. The convoy of soldiers, battered and half asleep, moved like shadows against the blood-red horizon. They'd been at war for years now, a silent, brutal standoff against the alien forces of the Zyrrhen Empire. He gripped his plasma rifle tighter, scanning the ridge. And then, without warning, the sky split open. A beam of blinding silver light erupted above, trailing smoke and fire as it crashed into the dunes not far from where his platoon had gathered. His fellow soldiers ducked instinctively, shielding their eyes. They'd seen enough of these landings to know the damage they could do, and none of them felt lucky enough to be in the direct path of whatever was incoming. Dunn, his commander, Lieutenant Hale, barked, "Go check it out. Report back." James gave a nod, swallowing hard. His heartbeat pulsed louder than the faint hum of the energy shield he activated around himself. As he advanced, the smell of scorched sand filled the air, mingling with the faint metallic scent that followed every Zyrrhen landing. He squinted, his helmet adjusting to give him a clearer view through the swirling dust. What he saw made him stop dead. An elegant figure emerged from the crashed pod, her skin a deep iridescent blue that shimmered in the light. Her eyes were unnaturally large, vibrant silver, scanning the desert with a calm intensity. James had seen Zyrrhen soldiers before, but this one, she was different. She wore a robe woven with threads that glowed faintly, marking her as a member of their elite. His pulse quickened as her gaze landed on him. He froze, but she began to approach, gliding over the uneven terrain with impossible grace. She stopped just a few feet away and tilted her head, studying him. The intensity of her gaze held him in place, and though she was unarmed, something in her posture hinted at immense power. "You are the one," she murmured, her voice a soft, melodic tone that resonated in his mind even more than his ears. He took a step back, gripping his rifle tighter. "What are you talking about?" "You," she repeated, lifting a slender hand and pressing it over her heart. "I am Lyra of Zara, first daughter of the High Council. I have come to claim you as my mate." James blinked, unable to process the words. He glanced around, hoping his team was close enough to hear. But they were still behind the ridge, out of earshot, likely watching through their scopes and recording feeds. He frowned, taking a measured step back. "Mate," he echoed, his voice uncertain. "Lady, you've got the wrong guy." Her silver eyes flashed and she took another step forward. "No, I have seen it. In our union lies a powerful future. Our offspring would embody a strength the Zyrrhen and human races have never known." The statement was so blunt, so surreal, he almost laughed. "This some kind of tactic?" he asked, not lowering his weapon. "Trying to throw me off guard?" Her expression softened, almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. "I have come a great distance and at great risk. This is no tactic, soldier. It is fate." A long silence stretched between them, with only the gusts of desert wind filling the gaps. James shifted, unable to meet her gaze for too long. He'd seen what Zyrrhen weapons could do, what they'd done to soldiers like him. Why would she want to ally with him, of all people? But she watched him with an unflinching certainty, her gaze never wavering. "I don't think you understand," he said, aiming to make his words as clear as possible. "Your people and mine, we're at war. There's no world where this happens." "War can end, Corporal James Dunn," she replied. Her voice was soft, though tinged with an undeniable authority. "But only if we shape a future where our differences don't lead to ruin. It begins with a union that defies all others." Her words sounded rehearsed, as if they'd been taught to her. But there was something in her expression, something genuine that made him hesitate. He opened his mouth to respond, but a blaring alarm cut through the air, its shrill tone pulling him from his trance. His comm came alive, buzzing with an urgent message from his commander. "Done. Report. You got a visual on that pod." James hesitated for a beat, glancing at Lyra. She raised her chin, as if urging him on. "Lieutenant, I've got a visual. Zyrrhen individual seems unarmed." Unarmed, Hale's voice was edged with skepticism. "Capture if possible. But if she tries anything—" "I know," Sir James interrupted. "Understood." He turned back to Lyra, his gaze hardening. "My orders are clear. You're coming with me." She lifted a brow, as if amused by the suggestion. "Very well. But remember, I chose you." She let her hands rest calmly at her sides as he gestured for her to move ahead. As they began walking back toward his platoon, he struggled to ignore the sense of foreboding lingering in his gut. He'd expected her to resist, to fight back in some way, yet here she was, walking with him voluntarily, her expression calm and assured. By the time they reached his unit, a dozen eyes were locked on her, their expressions a mix of horror and curiosity. Most had never seen a Zyrrhen this close up, and none had seen one as disarmingly serene as Lyra. Lieutenant Hale stepped forward, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Well done. Looks like you've brought us a gift." Lyra's gaze shifted to Hale, her eyes appraising him. "Greetings, Lieutenant," she said, her tone polite yet edged with subtle disdain. "I wish to speak with your leaders." "You'll be speaking to a holding cell," Hale replied. "Take her, Dunn." But as James moved to lead her away, she fixed her silver gaze on Hale. "I am no prisoner of war. I am a diplomat, here to discuss a truce. And I will speak with those in authority, or I will leave." Hale's brow furrowed. The Zyrrhen diplomatic corps was legendary, known for their cunning and their ability to manipulate. She could very well be telling the truth, or it could be a ruse to buy time for a larger assault. With a nod, Hale ordered 2 other soldiers to lead her away. Lyra paused, casting one last look at James. "Remember, Corporal," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I chose you." With that, she let herself be led away into the camp, her figure disappearing behind the bulk of the command tent. James watched her go, feeling a strange pang of unease settle over him. That night, he found himself turning her words over in his mind. The idea that he had somehow been chosen for something he didn't understand. The claim that they could end the war, that the Zyrrhen's brutal tactics could somehow be laid to rest. He'd been trained to follow orders, to see the enemy as something other than human. But then he'd looked into her eyes and he'd seen something there that felt strangely familiar. It wasn't compassion, exactly, but maybe a deep, unwavering purpose that he recognized. The following morning, he was summoned by the lieutenant. "Dunn," Hale said, looking up from a map of the desert. "Our friend from Zara wants to speak with you. Says she'll only talk if you're present." James straightened, though he fought to keep his expression neutral. "Orders, sir." "You'll go in with 3 guards," Hale replied, his gaze narrowing. "But keep this in mind, Corporal. She's dangerous. Zyrrhen don't come here for peace. They come for conquest, and they're more patient than you know. Keep her talking. Learn what you can." "Yes, sir." James headed toward the tent where Lyra was held, his mind racing with questions he hadn't dared ask himself. He pulled back the heavy tarp and stepped inside, flanked by guards. Lyra sat on a makeshift bench, her hands unbound, her gaze steady. "Corporal James," she greeted him with a faint smile. "It seems we have much to discuss." James took a steadying breath and met Lyra's gaze, feeling the weight of her strange, otherworldly presence fill the tent. Her expression was calm, as though she were holding court, rather than sitting in the center of an enemy military camp. "All right, Lyra," he said, his voice low. "You wanted to talk. I'm listening. And you might want to explain why I'm the one you came here for." Lyra tilted her head, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "We have the Zyrrhen value strength," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "And strength, Corporal James, can mean many things. In you, I sense something unique, of fire tempered by duty and a mind not clouded by fear of the unknown." James swallowed, unsure whether she was complimenting him or playing some twisted game. "Right," he said flatly. "But I'm not interested in flattering words. Why me? Why would you claim someone you don't even know?" Lyra's eyes glimmered, as if she'd been waiting for the question. "Among my people, choosing a mate is more than an alliance. It is a pledge to the future. The Zyrrhen believe that in the rare union of 2 opposing strengths, a new and even more formidable power can emerge." She looked at him, the fire in her gaze unwavering. "Together, our offspring would represent that power. They would be a symbol, and a bridge." "A bridge?" He gave a short, skeptical laugh. "Lady, you've chosen the wrong guy if you think I'd throw away everything for some vision." Her expression didn't falter. "Your war is eating you from within as much as ours is tearing us apart," she continued, an edge of urgency in her tone. "But our union could put an end to it. Our child would bear the qualities needed to lead both our people into a new era. Imagine it, James. An end to the fear, the bloodshed." But James wasn't convinced. "Your people kill humans without a second thought. I've watched friends die by Zyrrhen weapons, and you think I'll just agree to this because of some prophecy?" Lyra's calm composure shifted, her lips pressing into a firm line. "I understand your anger," she said, "but the human military is as responsible for this war as we are. Both sides have blood on their hands, and if you search your heart, you know that. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a soft, dangerous whisper. You and I, we could end this. Not by becoming something else, but by transcending what we are. Her words were hypnotic, alluring. James struggled to shake off the haze of her influence. He was only a soldier, a cog in a machine that didn't pause to consider dreams of peace. But something in the conviction in her gaze made him wonder if she could actually be telling the truth. Say I believed you, he replied carefully. How does this truce of yours work? You expect us to join hands in some fairy tale? That's not how things go around here. A flicker of frustration flashed in her eyes. Corporal, I am aware of your people's distrust. But we Zyrrhen do not make promises lightly. Once a mate is chosen, we pledge our lives to that bond. The child we would create could be a key to peace. Could be, he challenged. That's pretty weak for something you say will save both our people. She held his gaze, her expression unyielding. It is a leap of faith, yes, but one I am willing to take if it means the end of senseless bloodshed. And if you look within yourself, I think you'll find you're willing to do the same. Just as he was about to argue, the sound of gunfire erupted outside the tent. James sprang to his feet, rifle in hand, as he heard shouting and the unmistakable roar of enemy ships overhead. His instincts kicked in, and he looked back at Lyra, his gaze wary. Stay here, he ordered, though something told him she would do no such thing. Outside, chaos reigned. Enemy ships strafed the camp, their energy weapons tearing through sand and steel alike. Soldiers scrambled, firing into the sky, ducking behind whatever cover they could find. James spotted Lieutenant Hale near the command tent, barking orders into his comm. Lieutenant James shouted over the din. Where are they coming from? They must have tracked her pod, Hale yelled back, shooting him a hard look. We're about to be overrun, Dunn. Get back in there and make sure she doesn't get any ideas about escaping. James nodded, feeling his gut twist as he turned back toward the tent. But before he could reach it, a shimmering wall of silver light flared around him, nearly blinding him. He stumbled, looking around in confusion. The light faded, and standing before him was Lyra, untouched by the dust and smoke. Her outstretched hand glowed faintly, and he realized with a jolt that she'd generated the barrier. Corporal James, she said, her voice calm but insistent. These are my people. They will listen to me. You're kidding, he said, backing up as he scanned the camp. They don't look like they're interested in listening to anyone. They have their orders. But as a diplomat and royal, my words carry weight, she said. I can make them stand down. Despite every bone in his body telling him not to trust her, he found himself caught in her unwavering gaze. There was an authority in her that made him believe, against all reason, that she might just be telling the truth. He stepped back, signaling the soldiers around them to lower their weapons. All right, Lyra, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Do what you have to do. Lyra took a step forward, extending her hand as if reaching toward the Zyrrhen ship circling above. Her eyes closed, and a shimmering aura surrounded her, pulsing with energy that he could feel thrumming in his bones. She lifted her face to the sky, speaking in a language that was harsh, ancient, and oddly beautiful. The soldiers watched in a stunned silence as her voice carried through the smoke and din. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the enemy ships stopped firing. They hovered above, their weapons trained on the camp but eerily silent. James felt his heart race as he looked up at the vast warships, their sleek forms silhouetted against the morning sun. And then, one by one, they began to retreat, pulling back across the desert sky until they were little more than distant specks. James could barely believe his eyes. You did it, he said, his voice thick with astonishment. Lyra turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. I told you. They are my people. They know I would not risk my life so recklessly unless there was purpose. Hale strode up to them, his expression torn between relief and fury. Corporal, what the hell is going on here? How did she? She's more than just a soldier, Sir James replied, meeting his lieutenant's gaze. She's a diplomat, and she may have just saved us all. Hale glared at Lyra, distrust etched deeply into his features. So what now? You think we can trust her? But before James could respond, Lyra spoke, her voice clear and steady. Lieutenant Hale, if you wish to end this war, I will speak to your leaders. I will act as an ambassador to ensure peace between our people. Hale looked from her to James, then let out a resigned sigh. If she's right about her influence, this might just be our only shot. But don't think for a second that we're dropping our guard. Not yet. With a reluctant nod, he motioned for 2 guards to accompany them as they prepared to escort Lyra to the nearest human base. As they boarded the transport, James found himself sitting next to Lyra, the weight of everything that had just happened settling over him. The Zyrrhen princess beside him, the strange truth she was determined to create, the idea of a future that defied everything he knew it was all too much. Yet part of him, the part that had seen the look in her eyes, wanted to believe. "You were willing to risk a lot back there," he murmured, looking down at his hands. Lyra's expression softened, and she looked at him with a warmth he hadn't expected. "Some things are worth risking everything for. And whether you believe me or not, Corporal James, I have no regrets about choosing you." They sat in silence, the hum of the transport's engines filling the air. The human base was a rugged fortress carved into the side of a rocky cliff, its angular architecture bristling with turrets and energy shields. It stood isolated under the wide desert sky, defiant and cold against the horizon. As James and Lyra approached in the transport, he noticed how every turret followed them, each weapon ready to fire at a moment's notice. As soon as the transport touched down, a group of soldiers, led by the base commander, waited to meet them. Commander Evans was known for her steel resolve and uncompromising nature, her reputation as a seasoned leader well established. She was not someone who would easily trust a Zyrrhen, and Lyra's arrival set a tension in her jaw as she scanned the alien diplomat from head to toe. "So this is the Zyrrhen," Princess Evans asked, her tone sharp and her gaze wary. Lyra, unperturbed by the scrutiny, inclined her head with a calm dignity. "I am Lyra of Zyrrhen, here to negotiate peace." Evans crossed her arms, lips pressing into a thin line. "Peace, is it? The Zyrrhen and the word peace don't go together well from where I stand." "Which is why I am here," Lyra replied evenly. "To change that." Evans cast a questioning look at James. "And you, Corporal? What do you make of her story? A truce, some grand vision for a future that involves both of you." James felt the weight of her gaze. He wasn't one to believe easily, but something in Lyra's steady resolve had struck a chord he couldn't ignore. "Commander, I think we're in a position where every option has a price," he said carefully. "And if there's a chance to stop all of this, maybe it's worth hearing her out." Evans raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but she gave a resigned nod. "Fine. Let's get her inside for a debrief." Inside the base's command center, Lyra took her place in front of a long conference table, flanked by guards and watched by the gathered military leaders through a translucent screen. They eyed her with the same wary scrutiny, muttering and exchanging doubtful glances. Evans cleared her throat and addressed Lyra directly. "Princess Lyra, let's be clear. You're here because you think this union with one of our soldiers will somehow end centuries of conflict. Is that correct?" Lyra's eyes were as steady as steel. "The future can no longer be built on bloodshed. What I offer is not just a truce, but a pathway to unity. Our people are stronger together than apart, and our offspring could serve as a testament to that strength. We would be a bridge between the two species, forging a new beginning." A skeptical murmur rippled through the room, and Evans held up a hand to quiet them. "We've fought your kind for too long to take this at face value," she said. "Why should we believe you won't betray us the second we let our guard down?" Lyra looked around, her expression softening. "Because I have left my own people behind, risked my life, and am now at your mercy. I did not come here as a conqueror. I came as a willing ally, knowing that I could be executed the moment I arrived." Evans looked down, clearly deep in thought. "And you believe this? Union is our only hope." "Our people do not trust each other," Lyra said solemnly. "But a life born of both worlds would embody a future without war. This is our best chance." Evans was silent, looking from Lyra to James, the weight of a difficult choice hanging in the air. At last, she let out a long, slow breath. "We'll move forward cautiously," she said finally, her voice resolute. "If what you're saying is true, then we need to assess this. Union will allow you to stay under close observation. Any move against us, any threat, and it ends there. Understand?" Lyra nodded, her face calm. "Understood." Evans gave James a measured look. "Corporal, since she seems to trust you, you'll be assigned as her liaison. Make sure she remains cooperative." The days that followed were tense, with Lyra constantly shadowed by security personnel and James never far from her side. As they moved through the base, Lyra seemed to study everything with quiet intensity, watching the soldiers as they trained, observed, and prepared. Some looked at her with open curiosity, others with naked disdain, but none dared approach her, keeping their distance in wary silence. One evening, James found himself alone with her in the mess hall. The soldiers who lingered there gave her a wide berth, and he could see that she noticed the way they avoided her. "You'd think they'd get used to you by now," he said. offering a small smile. She tilted her head, a faint hint of sadness in her eyes. Fear is often the strongest bridge between unfamiliarity and hate. Not exactly a comforting thought, James replied, taking a sip of his coffee. But I suppose you're not wrong. They ate in silence for a while. But eventually, Lyra looked over at him, a serious expression on her face. James, she said softly, do you believe in what I'm offering? Or am I simply another enemy to you? He paused, struggling to find the right words. I won't pretend to understand why you chose me. But part of me wants to believe that what you're saying is true. I've been through enough battles to know that neither of our sides are winning. She gave a thoughtful nod. The future is uncertain, yes. But one thing is clear without a step toward unity. Both our people will suffer a slow, painful destruction. And I don't wish that for either of us. A moment of quiet passed between them, and James felt the walls of mistrust he'd built over the years weaken, just a little. There was something disarmingly genuine in her words, and the reality of her sacrifice became clearer to him every day. But just as their fragile trust began to solidify, the base alarms blared. An urgent message came through the comms. This is command. We have unidentified craft approaching fast. All personnel prepare for defensive positions. James bolted to his feet, heart pounding as the soldiers around them sprang into action. Lyra's expression turned grave, and she followed him out of the mess hall, keeping pace despite the chaos. He glanced at her, his mind racing. Are those Zyrrhen ships? He asked, barely containing the edge in his voice. Her jaw tightened, and she shook her head. No, these signatures, they don't belong to my people. This is something else. James's stomach churned as he looked out the window at the desert sky. A fleet of unfamiliar ships, sleek, with dark green hulls and aggressive, jagged designs descended on the base. They bore no markings that he recognized, but the firepower they unleashed was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Get to cover, he shouted, guiding Lyra into the nearest bunker as plasma blasts seared the air above them. The soldiers scrambled, hastily setting up a defense perimeter and returning fire at the descending ships. What in hell are they? James muttered as he crouched beside her, his rifle at the ready. Lyra's eyes narrowed, her expression unusually grim. Outcasts, she said, almost to herself. They are exiled factions from various worlds, scavengers and warlords. They've likely been watching both our peoples, waiting for an opening to exploit. The realization hit him hard. They're trying to take advantage of our war. She nodded. They see the Zyrrhen and humans as weakened by battle, and they're here to plunder what's left. Determined, James lifted his comm, barking orders to the units holding the defensive lines. The base rattled with each blast, but he didn't let up, his voice steady even as the soldiers' courage wavered. Lyra placed a hand on his arm. James, I can help. My people's weaponry and technology could turn the tide. You have a way to reach your people? He asked, uncertain but hopeful. She nodded. I can try to establish a secure channel, though it will be risky. He weighed his options. Their forces were stretched thin, and with every blast their defenses weakened. But if Lyra could summon reinforcements, they might stand a chance. Do it, he said, knowing he was placing immense trust in her. If we don't make it, at least we tried. Lyra gave a firm nod, then closed her eyes, summoning a device embedded in her wristband. It emitted a faint glow, and she spoke in the Zyrrhen tongue, her words swift and urgent. Moments later, her eyes opened, filled with a fierce determination. They're coming, she said. We must hold the line until they arrive. As the assault continued, Lyra joined the human soldiers, fighting side by side with them as they repelled wave after wave of the marauders. She moved with a fluidity that awed and inspired the soldiers around her, her grace and strength in battle, unlike anything they'd seen. Finally, just as their defenses seemed on the verge of collapse, Zyrrhen ships arrived, their sleek forms cutting through the sky as they engaged the marauders with devastating precision. The marauders, caught off guard, tried to retreat, but the Zyrrhen forces pursued them relentlessly, forcing the scavenger ships to scatter and retreat. When the dust finally settled, the base was battered but intact, and a quiet awe filled the air as the human soldiers looked upon the Zyrrhen ships circling above in a defensive formation. Evans approached James and Lyra, her expression a mix of gratitude and suspicion. Well, Princess, I never thought I'd say this, but thank you. Lyra inclined her head, her expression sincere. You are welcome. I believe that together we can accomplish much. Evans nodded, then turned to James. Corporal, get her debriefed and ensure she's secure. As he led Lyra back into the base, James felt a strange sense of camaraderie settle between them. They had faced a common enemy, survived together. And though the idea of peace seemed far off, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had taken the first real step toward it. As after the Marauder attack, a tentative alliance had begun to form between the Zyrrhen and the humans stationed at the desert base. Although tension still simmered beneath the surface, soldiers on both sides had seen Lyra and James fighting together, and the memory of their combined strength had left a powerful impression. Commander Evans, ever the skeptic, called a high-level meeting to discuss next steps. James and Lyra sat side by side in the briefing room, an arrangement that didn't go unnoticed by the gathered officials. The conference was being transmitted to military heads across the continent, and a representative of the Zyrrhen High Command joined the meeting by secure holographic link. After recent events, Evans began, glancing between James and Lyra, were forced to confront a new reality. The Marauders showed us exactly what could happen if we remained divided. They exploited our weaknesses, and next time they might not back down. We're prepared to entertain this alliance. But let's be clear, cooperation must be on our terms. Across the table, the holographic figure of General Chorus, a Zyrrhen officer, leaned forward, his dark eyes sharp. Peace requires understanding and concessions, Commander, he said, his voice smooth but firm. This bond between Lyra and the Corporal is more than symbolic. Their unity can shape something unprecedented. A murmur ran through the room and Evans folded her arms. With all due respect, General Chorus, our willingness to accept Lyra here has stretched our boundaries. Trusting her to carry out a vision that could change both our worlds is a tall order. Lyra spoke up, her tone calm but resolute. It's understandable, Commander Evans, but both sides have something to gain. My people don't seek domination, nor do we seek servitude. What we offer is integration, a future where neither humans nor Zyrrhen live in fear. The room fell silent. It was James who finally broke the quiet. If this alliance really has a shot, then we need a reason to believe in it beyond words, he said, addressing the entire assembly. Let Lyra and me carry out a joint mission, something that proves we can rely on each other. If we succeed, maybe we'll earn the trust this alliance needs to survive. Evans narrowed her eyes. And what mission would you propose, Corporal? James looked at Lyra, his mind racing. We take down one of the Marauder outposts near the Zyrrhen border. If we do it together, we'll have proved that a combined force is more powerful than either of our armies alone. Lyra inclined her head in agreement. I can arrange for a Zyrrhen strike team to accompany us. If we succeed, it will send a message to the Marauders and to our own people. After a long, tense pause, Evans finally nodded. Very well. You've got your mission. But know this, Corporal, if anything seems off, if you so much as suspect betrayal, you are to pull back immediately. Understood. James nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility settle over him. Understood, Commander. The next morning, James and Lyra stood at the edge of the desert, preparing to set out with their mixed strike team. Zyrrhen soldiers with sleek energy rifles and advanced armor stood shoulder to shoulder with human troops, their expressions guarded but ready. As James checked his gear, Lyra approached, her eyes glimmering with a quiet intensity. Are you ready? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ready as I'll ever be, he replied, though his pulse quickened as he considered the mission ahead. Funny how we went from fighting each other to this. Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. It's strange, yes. But there's a part of me that believes this was meant to happen. They exchanged a glance, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Their bond had been born out of conflict, yet it had become something deeper, a connection neither could ignore. In the silence that followed, James felt a tug at his heart, a feeling that went beyond duty or honor. But he pushed it down, turning his focus to the mission. Let's get this done. They set off into the desert, moving as a unit, the sand whispering beneath their boots as they advanced. The Marauder outpost they were targeting lay hidden within a sprawling canyon, a fortress of patched metal and repurposed alien tech. Their objective was clear: dismantle the base, seize the weapons, and bring back any intelligence that could help predict future attacks. The journey was long and exhausting. By the time they reached the canyon, night had fallen, and the desert air had turned biting and cold. As they gathered in a ridge overlooking the Marauder compound, James and Lyra exchanged nods, then signaled the mixed team to fan out and take their positions. James pulled up a scanner, studying the layout below. The compound was heavily fortified, with guards posted along the perimeter and turrets sweeping across the entrance. He glanced at Lyra. We'll need a distraction, he whispered. A small team draws their attention from the north while the rest of us slip in from the south. Lyra gave a slight nod and relayed the plan in Zyrrhen to her soldiers. Within moments, the northern team slipped down the ridge, blending seamlessly with the shadows. They were so quiet, James almost missed their movements entirely. Lyra's people had a grace and precision that fascinated him, and he felt a growing respect for her and her people's skill. When the first shot echoed across the compound, the guards snapped to attention, their weapons trained on the northern ridge. The turrets shifted focus, leaving the southern entrance vulnerable. Taking advantage of the distraction, James, Lyra, and the rest of the strike team moved forward, hugging the shadows as they crept closer. Inside the compound, they encountered minimal resistance, the marauders drawn to the north as expected. As they advanced through the labyrinthine halls, James noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, marking the territory of some unknown faction. The symbols resembled ancient carvings he'd only seen in the reports of unexplored worlds, indications that these marauders had ties to alien races older than humanity itself. The realization gave him pause. If these marauders had access to advanced, ancient tech, their ambitions were likely greater than mere plunder. Lyra, he murmured, gesturing to the symbols. These markings, do they mean anything to you? She studied the carvings, her expression darkening. They're sigils of the Terrav, a race of mercenaries, brutal and relentless. They have been banished from many worlds. It seems they've set their sights on yours. Not just ours, he replied grimly. If they have the tech to bring down both of our forces, they'll take whatever they want. We need to stop them here, or we'll both be in serious trouble. They pressed on, their objective clear, reached the central command room and disabled the base's shields to allow an airstrike. But as they neared the heart of the compound, a new threat appeared. An alarm blared, and from the shadows, a squad of Terrav mercenaries emerged, armed with weapons that crackled with strange violet energy. James and his team ducked behind cover as blasts of alien energy sizzled overhead, leaving deep scars in the metal walls. Pinned down, James tried to strategize, but the Terrav had them cornered. His gaze met Lyra's, and he saw a glint of determination in her eyes. James, she said, her voice steady despite the danger, I have an idea. If I create a diversion, can you take the others and secure the control room? He hesitated, the thought of letting her face them alone twisting his gut. Are you sure? She smiled, the calm assurance in her eyes both maddening and inspiring. Trust me, Corporal. Without waiting for a reply, she leapt out from behind the cover, moving with a swift, fluid grace. She fired a series of energy blasts that ricocheted off the walls, creating a brilliant display of light and sound that disoriented the Terrav soldiers. The mercenaries turned toward her, distracted, and in that brief window, James rallied his team forward. They pushed through the compound, encountering minimal resistance now that Lyra had drawn the Terrav's attention. Within minutes, they reached the command center. James quickly located the shield controls, his hands moving swiftly over the unfamiliar interface. After a tense moment, the shields dropped, and he activated his comm. Command, this is Corporal Dunn. Shields are down. You're clear for airstrike. The response was immediate. Acknowledged, Corporal. Airstrike inbound. Get your team out of there. James turned to his team, motioning for them to retreat, but his gaze drifted back toward the hallway where Lyra had drawn the mercenaries. A gnawing worry took hold of him, and he clenched his fists, torn between duty and something else, something he wasn't ready to admit to himself. I'm going back for her, he said, ignoring the startled looks from his team. Before anyone could protest, he sprinted down the hallway, his heart pounding. He found her in a narrow corridor, locked in a fierce battle with the remaining Terrav mercenaries. Her energy rifle glowed hot, and her face was streaked with sweat. Yet she fought with an unbreakable focus, her movements a deadly blend of strength and elegance. But one of the Terrav soldiers was closing in, weapon raised. Lyra, he shouted, raising his rifle and firing a single, precise shot. The Terrav soldier crumpled to the ground, and Lyra turned to him, her eyes widening in surprise. James, she breathed, a look of relief crossing her face. Come on, he said, extending a hand. Airstrike's incoming. We've got to get out of here. She nodded, taking his hand as they sprinted back through the compound, weaving through the halls as explosions began to rock the building. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and dust filled the air, making it hard to see. But they pressed on, refusing to let go of each other's grip. At last, they emerged from the compound, stumbling onto the ridge just as a series of missiles struck the base behind them. The blast sent a shockwave through the canyon, and James threw himself over Lyra, shielding her from the debris as his fire erupted around them. When the smoke cleared, they lay on the ground, breathing heavily. James looked down at her, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, an unspoken bond passing between them. He realized that, somewhere along the line, his duty had become more than a mission, it had become a commitment to her, to the strange and powerful future she represented. "Thank you, James," she whispered, her voice soft. He nodded, finally letting the truth settle within him. "We're in this together, Lyra. Whatever comes next, we'll face it side by side." The sounds of the strike team's approach broke the moment, and James rose to his feet, helping Lyra up. As they walked back toward the base, the weight of their mission of the future they had begun to build hung in the air between them, tangible and real. And as they glanced at each other, they knew that their journey was only beginning. Upon their return to the base, James and Lyra were welcomed with restrained relief. While their joint mission had succeeded, rumors had begun to spread among the troops, whispers filled with both awe and distrust. Some soldiers saw Lyra as a hero, a key to ending the war, but others saw her as a threat, a ticking bomb brought inside their own lines. The days that followed were tense. James noticed the sideways glances, the murmurs that halted whenever he entered a room. His fellow soldiers kept a wary distance from him, as if his association with Lyra had somehow set him apart. The weight of their stares hung heavy on him, but he steeled himself, determined to see their mission through. One evening, he met with Lyra on a deserted balcony overlooking the base. The quiet of the desert night surrounded them, and he found a strange comfort in her presence, a calm that contradicted the turmoil brewing around them. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "if we're asking too much of ourselves, expecting peace from those who have never known it?" James considered this, the shadows of their shared mission casting doubt on his usual certainty. "I'd be lying if I said I didn't, but giving up now would mean all this was for nothing. The people we've lost, they would have died for nothing." She nodded, her silver eyes reflecting the faint starlight. "It is a rare thing to find someone who can hold to hope, even in the darkest hours. Among my people you would be called a Lacarosis, one who forges light from shadows." He managed a small smile. "Well, you can call me whatever you want, but you'd better believe I'm not giving up." They stood in silence, side by side, the vast desert stretching out before them. In that quiet moment, James felt something shift between them, a deeper bond that went beyond duty or strategy. It was a connection born of shared battles, sacrifices, and an unspoken trust that was becoming harder to ignore. But the peace didn't last. The next morning, they received news that shattered the fragile sense of hope they'd begun to build. A message had arrived from the Zyrrhen High Command, a cold, formal communique that filled the room with tension as Lyra read it aloud. Her voice was steady, but her face was pale, her hands clenched into fists. "It seems," she said, her tone tight, "that my people have grown impatient. They see our mission as a potential threat to the status quo, a risk they are no longer willing to tolerate." Commander Evans frowned. "What exactly does that mean, Lyra?" Lyra took a breath, steadying herself. "The High Council has demanded my return. They believe I've compromised myself, that my connection to this alliance has weakened my loyalty." Her words sent a chill through the room, and James felt his heart sink. "So what happens now? Are they calling off the alliance?" "No," she replied, her voice fierce. "But they will test it. They've given us a deadline, 3 days. We must prove that this alliance has a measurable advantage, or they will abandon it. And me." Evan's jaw tightened. "So they're willing to sacrifice you if it means they don't have to risk more." Lyra nodded, her gaze steady despite the betrayal she clearly felt. "It is. Not unexpected. But I didn't think they would turn so quickly. Our mission was a success, but they see it as an outlier. If we don't show more, they will take it as a sign of weakness." James felt a surge of anger. "After everything you've done, they're treating you like a pawn." She looked at him, her silver eyes softening. "They believe they are protecting our people, just as your commanders believe they are protecting yours. But we do not have to let them dictate our future." A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, Commander Evans spoke, her voice laced with grim resolve. "If we're going to prove them wrong, we'll need something decisive," she said. "Something that shows what a united force can do." A plan began to form. The Marauders were still a threat, their forces gathering on the edges of both human and Zyrrhen territory, preparing to strike again. If James, Lyra, and their joint strike team could dismantle one of the larger Marauder bases, it would demonstrate the potential strength of their alliance and perhaps convince both sides that this partnership was more than a gamble. Preparations moved quickly. In the days leading up to the mission, James and Lyra trained side by side, drilling their team in the intricacies of human and Zyrrhen tactics, coordinating their skills into a seamless, efficient force. The more they worked together, the more they came to anticipate each other's moves, an unspoken rhythm developing between them. As they prepared for the final assault, James pulled Lyra aside. "If we pull this off, maybe your people will finally see what you're trying to do." She looked at him, her expression a mix of hope and sadness. "Perhaps. But I would rather succeed knowing that I had you beside me." His heart beat faster, and he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm with you, Lyra, all the way." The next night, their combined force moved under the cover of darkness toward the Marauder base. The compound sprawled across a valley, its turrets glowing faintly, guards patrolling every entrance. They could see supply convoys winding toward it, evidence that the Marauders were amassing for something big. Evans coordinated with General Chorus, the Zyrrhen commander who had initially been skeptical. Together, they formed a strategy, targeting the base's central command and disabling the energy shields that protected it. James and Lyra's team would lead the initial assault, clearing the path for the main forces. As they waited for the signal to advance, James felt the tension in the air, every breath heavy with anticipation. He looked at Lyra, who stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the base below. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "I wouldn't change a thing." She met his eyes, a quiet fire in her gaze. "Nor would I." At the signal, they surged forward, advancing in synchronized waves as they fired on the guards and dodged incoming blasts. Their movements were precise, the mixed team moving with a unity that defied years of division. The battle was intense, each step forward hard-won, but together they pushed closer to the command center. Finally, they reached the heart of the base, a massive control room encased in reinforced alloy. Lyra hacked the door's interface with practiced skill, and within moments they were inside, a tense silence hanging over them as they secured the room. Just as they began disabling the shield controls, an alarm blared. A massive contingent of Marauders swarmed the room, their alien weaponry filling the air with harsh violet energy. Lyra fought beside him, her movements fierce and precise, but the numbers were overwhelming. In the chaos, James saw one of the Marauders leveling a weapon directly at Lyra. He lunged, pushing her aside just as the blast seared through the air, grazing his shoulder. He bit back a cry, the pain sharp and burning, but he stayed on his feet, his grip on his weapon steady. "James," Lyra cried, her voice laced with concern. "I'm fine," he managed, gritting his teeth. "Focus on the controls." With a final, determined effort, she brought down the shields, and a cheer went up among their forces as the remaining Zyrrhen and human troops surged in, overpowering the Marauders with brutal efficiency. When the last of the enemies had fallen, a quiet settled over the room, the reality of their victory sinking in. They had done it together. As the soldiers gathered, Commander Evans stepped forward, her expression unreadable as she addressed the team. "What we've done here will be remembered. We may be from different worlds, different histories, but today we fought as one." General Chorus's hologram appeared beside her, his expression softened, his voice carrying a hint of respect. "This victory proves that there is power in unity. Lyra, Corporal Dunn, your courage has shown us a path we did not think possible." Evans nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "Consider this alliance official. We'll report back to our high commands. It's time we put our differences aside for good." As the soldiers celebrated, James felt Lyra's hand slip into his. He looked at her, a mixture of relief and something deeper filling his chest. For once, there was no threat, no imminent danger. They were simply together, standing on the edge of a future they had forged. "What now?" he asked, a smile tugging at his lips. Lyra looked out over the valley, her expression thoughtful. "Now we build, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that will come after us. A future we can be proud of." And in that moment, as they stood side by side in the desert night, James knew that their journey, whatever it held, was just beginning. Together, they had overcome the scars of war, defied the expectations of two worlds, and found hope where none had dared to look. Hand in hand, they turned toward the horizon, ready to face the unknown, no longer just a soldier and a princess, but partners in the truest sense.